Okay. Well, first of all, thanks ever so much for joining this GEReCo IGU-CGE seminar. This is our sort of annual seminar, spring seminar, and we're delighted to join that Dr. John Hopkin has joined us to talk about standards in geography. I'm losing my voice, I'm really sorry. We've also got two responders, Sarah and Iram, who are going to sort of offer comments afterwards. We did say that we'll have any questions probably after John's spoken. So if anybody wants to kind of pop questions in the chat while he's speaking, I'll field those after he's spoken. And then we'll ask Iram to respond first, and then Sarah will respond then. And then there'll be a sort of opportunity for general discussion a little bit after that. And we'll finish no later than 5:30. So with no further ado, John, do you want to share your screen? If everybody who isn't speaking could be on mute during the session, and then obviously when we come to the discussion, you can always take yourself off mute.
Okay, so whilst I'm fiddling around, I just want to say that my laptop slid gracefully off the kitchen table a couple of weeks ago, and the screen's gone wonky. I can see reasonably well, but it goes in and out of focus. So kind of everything is a bit blurred, and I might be a bit slower than usual. That's my excuse anyway. Can everybody see that all right? Yeah, okay. So I thought I'd start with a picture of the research report, which you can find on the GA website, and there's a link down there if you haven't already found the full report. Really what started me off was the 2023 subject report for geography. And when I looked at it, I thought two things really. I thought, well, we've had 30 years of this sort of stuff. What do we learn from it? And the second thing I thought was, having started to read it, I was reading quite a lot of things which I was sure I'd read before in previous subject reports. So I've decided to look back through the whole suite of reports, of subject reports, and I came up with these questions, which is principally about how standards have changed over time, and whether there are kind of improvements or weaknesses. And I also got to start thinking about what we mean by standards, and what limits are there to our understanding of them. The other thing that got me going was this book from David and Mark, which I contributed to actually over 10 years ago. It was the first edition of this. And David asked me to write about Key Stage 3 in the national curriculum, which was kind of like a summary of where we were, what had been achieved, and where we were going. And I was actually a bit short of material, to be honest, because plenty of people have written about that before. So I thought I'd have a look back for evidence of standards in geography in the subject reports. And it was that really that piqued my interest and led to me pulling it all together, starting in 2023. I really like this quote, which was at the start of David's introduction, which is about taking the long view and thinking about what's been effective and what hasn't. And of course, in geography, we're often very focused on the short and medium term, but possibly don't take as often as we might to step back and review things and evaluate what we might do next. So this is just a sort of salutary reminder for me, as much as anybody, is that although we often think about ourselves as being about UK geography, actually we're really about geography in England, because it's different in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and certainly Ofsted has only got responsibility for English schools. So let's just bear that in mind. Sometimes I'll talk about the UK in relation to exam results, but essentially this is about England. And of course, in the UK, the great majority of schools are in England, around 25,000 compared with just over 10,000 in the other nations. But having said that, there may be lessons to learn in other jurisdictions. So here we are. This is the very first report, and I couldn't have done this without my habit of squirreling stuff away, because a lot of the early material just isn't available. It's pre-internet, and it's pre the era of PDFs on the internet as well. So I managed to pull together some early hard copy editions of these reports and add them to the more recent online ones. There have been 6 of them. There were actually 2 in 1993, followed by one in 1995, and those were about the first 3 years of the national curriculum. So they're very much how's the national curriculum getting started? What can we learn from it? And there was quite a pause then until 2008, another one quite quickly in 2011, and another long pause until 2023. So first lesson from this is these reports are pretty episodic. Underlying those, for a long period, up until about 2005, there was a series of almost annual primary and secondary subject reviews pulled together by HMI, but including information from general and school inspections. And then finally, underpinning all of these, regular HMCI national reports, which until around the same day had a brief report on subjects, and they were quite useful because they pulled together, although they're much in outline, they have much more information about achievement, for example. They're very data-based. But essentially, the meat of this is from the 6 full subject reports. One of the problems is that these reports change in format. So I had to find a way through the sort of morass, really. I decided to organise the material under these headings: curriculum, teaching, leadership and management, and achievement. One of the features of the reports is that you sometimes find material about achievement under teaching and vice versa. So I've kind of done my best to sort of regulise it, but it's not a kind of perfect world in terms of the information. One of the things I noticed was that people tended to use the word standards quite loosely. Ofsted remit is for both quality and standards, and even they use them almost interchangeably at times in the reports. Back in, I think, 1998, Geography did a whole special edition on standards. Probably wouldn't get that in Geography today. There was a paper by Peter Smith there, and he suggested that standards were more about achievement and outcomes, and that they were measurable, but quality was more a matter of professional judgment. So I put together this little model which suggests, in my mind anyway, and for the mind of the report, quality is kind of more about provision, standards is more about outcomes, and, excuse me, yeah. Yeah. So essentially, the Ofsted formula is that good provision, quality curriculum, assessment, teaching, etc., inevitably leads to good outcomes, and that poor outcomes generally are the result of inadequate provision in some respects. So that's the way I went anyway. Effectively, these two things are so closely interlinked that it's really quite difficult to sort of separate them, and I haven't really tried to do that. Here's a summary of those subject reports with the dates of publications. One of the things I noticed was that some of the reports were actually really upfront about how many schools they visited. With others, it's a bit more difficult to work out. But there they are on the right-hand side, and I've calculated the percentage of schools by looking back at the number of maintained schools in those years. And one of the things you'll notice is that most of the reports sample about 1% of schools. In other words, 1% of schools were visited by geography HMIs. I guess one of the exceptions is that middle one, which included data from 3.5% of schools, and that's because they've supplemented their evidence from a wider field. The other exception is the latest one, which only visited 25 secondary schools and 25 primary schools, so under around 0.2%, and that was by far the smallest sample of the series. So that's the but, really. It's a big but. It's our main source of evidence about standards, but it's a fairly flaky one in some respects, and particularly the most recent report. I'd say it's difficult to make reliable judgments based on a sample of 0.2% of schools. Okay, what I've tried to do here is kind of put together the big picture of how standards varied over time, and I will go into a bit more detail about the ins and the outs of that. So essentially, the early period after the national curriculum, most reports suggested things were improving, with certain questions about particular areas and key stages. But in general, in spite of early difficulties with geography, things were on the up in schools. Then there was kind of like a middle period with setbacks, challenges, and concerns. And in particular, for a number of both subject and HMR reports, geography was regarded as the weakest subject. Key stage 1 to 3. Conversely, GCSE was much stronger. Last two reports, perhaps a bit more of a sense of improvement, particularly the latter one. And in secondary schools, GCSE has become weaker than Key Stage 3, in part because of the iron gripper for the GCSE specifications. So that's the big picture of how standards have changed. I have to say it's pretty impressionistic, because none of the reports really pin this down. It's kind of more my gut feeling. But I'll go into some of the underpinning details of that next. So in both key stages, the reports kind of consistently emphasize the benefits of the kind of basics of geography teaching, clear objectives, balance between knowledge and understanding and skills, benefits of inquiry and geographical learning, sitting on a bed of good curriculum planning, sequenced, so that there's continuity and progression in what youngsters learn. And then kind of sitting around that consistently for primary schools, a kind of best versus the rest feeling. That some primary schools geography provision and standards are really rather good, and particularly where it's led by subject coordinators who know what they're doing. And then there's a kind of big tail of schools which are kind of doing their best, but haven't really got the means to do a really good job, particularly in terms of pressure on time, lack of expertise, teacher confidence, and interpreting a curriculum which is arguably more complex than other subjects. In secondary school, particularly since it's led by specialists in great part. Questions about the quality of the curriculum that it's really rather variable in looking between schools. And again, the impact of specialist teaching on standards. In the early reports, occasionally you'd get a comment about non-specialist teaching at Key Stage 3, and that's now bled into non-specialist teaching at Key Stage 4 in the last 2 reports, actually. In some of the middle reports, there's also, HMI also commented on the impact of, the early and middle reports, the impact of integrated humanities courses, the negative impact on standards in secondary schools. That's largely a thing of the past, I think. So one of the things, I didn't actually spend too long on the leadership and management part of it, but one of the consistent themes was, sorry. Yeah, one of the consistent themes was the link between good leadership and high standards. And there's a kind of really good little quote there about, it's a secondary school actually, but just take a minute to browse through that. If you were the geography team in that school, you'd be glowing with pride by that rating. So a little bit more of a summary. Over 30 years, it seems to me that on the basis of these Ofsted reports, we can note a success for the national curriculum, but a qualified one, because in spite of raising standards, there's still significant persistent weaknesses. So in all, at least 5.5 million students taking GCSE courses. It's really quite a lot, really, since 2000. And we can acknowledge real strengths in some areas, particularly managing the curriculum, strengths in managing in teaching and in achievement. But on the other hand, some of the weaknesses that were pointed out in the very early reports have still persist today. And I'll particularly point out in terms of curriculum, inadequate teaching of places or inconsistent teaching of places, geographical skills, not really integrated into the curriculum, often taught as one-offs, not really taught as the means to find out about the world. Fieldwork, actually a strength in the early reports, became a bit of a concern in the middling period, and in the last report, it's clearly fallen off the edge. And throughout, particularly in primary schools, but in some secondary schools as well, limited time to teach the full national curriculum. In terms of teaching, assessment has been a particular and consistent problem for schools, although in the latest report, assessment seemed to have picked up with more of a pivot towards assessment for learning and strengths in that area. And certainly in my special interest group in the GA, our teacher colleagues are reporting really pretty good practice in that respect. The question is whether that's as consistent as it might be. ICT has been another sort of rather a bit of a detail, but that's been consistently difficulty with quite clearly some youngsters missing out on that, and latterly GIS. Underpinning this, questions about teacher expertise and a lack of geography-focused CPD. So it's very much a sort of a one hand and on the other picture, as Ofsted would often put it themselves. Just something briefly about geographical skills. There's 2 really nice little quotes. It's one of the great things about reading through these reports. is that the best reports include really interesting little pen portraits of what's going on. And here's two great little summaries of how geographical skills are used well in a primary school and secondary school. Just give you a quick moment to skim through that. The little cube graphic in the corner is to remind me to say that really from the outset, I always thought one of the strengths of the national curriculum was this cube, which I think possibly, I don't think it even made it into the final report, but it certainly influenced the thinking that places, geographical skills, and thematic work were intertwined in the subjects. And the three related really closely to each other. But it's pretty clear to me that that idea of integrating geographical skills it's not really taken off, or is really as consistent as it should be. And to me, geographical skills is the way to finding out and engaging with information in all its various sources about the world, and particularly the practice of, in secondary schools, of teaching geographical skills as a separate unit early on in the course, and they're not really revisiting them, let alone planning for integrating and progressing them through the course. Is very much a consistent feature through all the reports. Okay, a little bit of a chance to say something about places. One of the motivations behind the national curriculum was to rebalance geography back in favour of places. Hence that sort of tripartite structure. And I would say that in that respect, the national curriculum has not been a success, because another massively consistent feature right through all reports is that places are taught inconsistently or even indeed weakly. So not particularly strong in planning. When they're taught, they're often taught in relation to themes. So they play a supporting role in learning about the geography of rivers or cities or whatever it is. And that in geography we have a particular problem in that our world has changed so rapidly. It's really quite difficult for teachers to keep up. And I particularly single out, I think that the combination of places being largely outside of many teachers' thinking in their planning, and the model of the world is divided into developed and developing countries, serves students really poorly. So the outcomes are students ending up with simplistic knowledge of places, sometimes rather stereotypical, limited number of locations experienced, perhaps rather shallowly, fragmented, places not connected to each other, and overall a sense that other places are the other and they're not really connected to us, our experience. It seems to me, after reading these reports, things haven't really changed in some respects since I was at school, and we learned about the developed world and the undeveloped world. So for me, this is a bit of a priority for further work, and perhaps in relation to the curriculum review, a rethink about how that's achieved. I'm going to just say a little bit about GCSE standards. It's our only other real alternative source of information about standards other than the Ofsted reports. And it's GCSE is kind of a bit of a check on what's happening in geography at the end of students' statutory period of education. So I'm going to take you quickly through those and just point out a few things. This first is about GCSE entries, it's percent of Key Stage 4. And you can see that over the period from 2010 to 2023, it's put on about 15% of students. It's really quite a significant increase. And you can see that the biggest increase was between about 2011 and 2016, which I've marked. And that's the first examination of the new GCSE specs, i.e. the current ones. So in many ways, that's pretty significant achievement, largely, I suspect, because of the requirement for the EBAC in secondary schools. This is looking at GCSE outcomes. This is a UK graph, and geography is the blue line, and all subjects is the red one. So for the period up until about 2010, both geography and all subjects were improving their outcomes at a pretty rapid lick. And that's kind of what naturally happens as teachers get better, they get more used to the specifications, they improve their teaching, and grades were soaring upwards. That came to a rapid and sudden jarring halt in about 2011. And I suspect that was the time people started thinking grades can't keep going up. We're going to have to kind of maintain standards, i.e. make sure they don't keep going up forever. But interestingly, that's also the point where geography, which for the whole of the noughties, geography students were achieving above all subjects. The two came closely into line. And then after 2016, which, as you remember, was the first examination date for the new specs, geography started dipping behind all subjects. So what was a grade premium in the noughties has now become a little bit of a deficit in geography compared with all subjects. You might speculate that's because that might be related to that broadening of the cohort that we just looked at. So in other words, more students are taking geography, but perhaps digging into a wider range of ability. So that's the key date, 2016. This is another aspect of standards, which is the gap between girls and boys. All subjects again is red, geography is blue. And you see from that, for much of the early part of the period, although girls outperform boys, as they do in all subjects, the gap was smaller in geography than all subjects. So in that regard, standards in geography rather good. A kind of a little blip in the early 2010s, where gender gap in geography exceeded all subjects. And then where we are now, it's back to normal service, gender gaps reducing, and the gender gap is smaller in geography. In terms of achievement, there's also an achievement gap. Girls achieve better than boys. And interestingly, that's significantly higher at A level. Be interesting to work out why that was. I've sneaked this in because one of the things in our assessment group we do is monitor GCSE and A level results every year. So this isn't in the report, but I've popped it in anyway, because we've been, for a few years now, been concerned that A level entries seem to be falling off. So what I've done here is I've tracked GCSE and A-level entries as a percent of all subjects. A-levels in red, GCSEs in blue, and you can see for much of the period, the two have kind of closely tracked each other. And then suddenly around 2018, A-level results began, A-level entries began to fall off in relation to GCSE entries. And again, intriguingly, if the first examination for the new GCSE specs was in 2016, those students were finishing A-level in 2018. So one hypothesis is that those new GCSE specs didn't encourage students to continue to A-level. I'm just going to wrap up with thinking about the education system, and this is a diagram from David Gardner's book about planning curriculum. This is derived from Tim Oates's report, I think 2010 or 2011, which was about learning from how high-performing countries manage their curriculum. And his point was that in the best performing countries, assessment, inspection, curriculum, pedagogy, accountability, they're kind of in alignment. They're all trying to do the same thing. In the UK, they're misaligned and arguably have become more so in the last decade. So it's kind of more difficult to pull together to raise standards. I guess an exception to that was the action plan for geography in, I think, 2008 to 2011, which pulled together the inspectorate, so subject to association, government, with a bit of funding to try and improve standards in geography. And it was very effective, particularly in primary schools. So in order to raise standards, it does help to have a system which is long together. Looking forwards, I've got a question really, which is about the ownership standards. It seems to me we've kind of delegated standards to Ofsted to manage for us. And what would I'd certainly put the case for a system where schools notionally they have responsibility for standards, but at subject leadership level, do they have the tools to do so? For example, it would be really helpful if we knew that Ofsted were going to produce a subject report for geography, say every 6 or 7 years, rather than having to wait 12 years between one and another. Again, one of the system features, it seems to me, of a less than functional system is that the inspection regime is like the eye of Sauron, really. It kind of swivel rounds to subjects for a year or two, and then its attention is taken by something else. So more regular subject reporting would be extremely helpful. Back in about 2013, we had the last edition of Ofsted's guidance and criteria for self-evaluation. Told you what excellent looked like in geography, or good looked like. Really helpful for primary coordinators and secondary subject leaders to empower themselves and raise standards for themselves. We haven't really got any benchmarks for geography. The only ones we got is for GCSE. It's not a lot of help if you're trying to work out where achievement is in year 5 or year 7, for example. So doesn't stop considerable number of secondary schools trying to do that. So we've got some GA guidance on benchmarks for standards. perhaps a little bit more work on promoting those through the new curriculum review would be extremely helpful. In terms of what the community can do, I think really is a place for rethinking what the purpose of geographical skills is and how places can be reintegrated to the subject in a way which is useful for teachers, and particularly for students, and it's kind of like about the modern world rather than the version of the world which was 20 or 25 years ago. One of the things that each curriculum review seems to be to do is to kind of tinker and rebuild things on the framework of what's gone before. As there's no doubt this curriculum review will do that again. And certainly GCSE specs have got absolutely no incentive to risk their market share by doing something different. But just having a look back as well as a look forwards, I think would be a really valuable move for them. A detail, it seems to be very striking that history teachers are pretty confident about talking about time in their lessons. Why is it that geography teachers can't talk about place? It's our major thing. And why is it that every awarding body talks about the rest of the world in different ways? It's sort of an alphabet soup of different acronyms for different countries. Or can't we just, like history talks about the Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages? They don't mess around. They all talk about time in the same way. Let's see why we shouldn't do the same. Obviously, fieldwork needs a rethink. I think a little bit more of a discussion about standards, as much as talking about curriculum and assessment, would be extremely valuable. Okay, that's it for me. Let me see if I can.
Thank you.
There we are. Stop share.
Lovely. Thanks ever so much, John. That was a really fascinating talk, and some really interesting insights there around sort of standards in geography. I'm just going to give people a minute or two, either to pop any questions that they have immediately in the chat, or if you want to come on the microphone, if you put your hand up, I think you can do that. And then we can come to various people if they have any immediate questions. Okay. So thanks, David. David's put in the chat. Thanks, John. Great overview.
Whilst we're waiting for that, I'm going to hold up a book here, which I really oh we are. You can just see it. No, it's back to front, isn't it? It's called. I've been reading this history of the Viking Age, a lot about geography, by Eleanor Barraclough. It's called Embers of the Hands. I kind of recommend it as reading to anybody, but she makes the point that we don't know too much about the Vikings. It's like looking back over 1,000 years through pretty dimly and just sort of scrabbling around for little bits of evidence and trying to build a picture on top of that. I kind of felt I was doing a bit the same because, well, there's probably a bit more evidence about standard. There isn't nearly as much as we could really do with to make definitive judgments.
Just while we're waiting to see if anybody puts any questions in the chat, John, was there anything that really kind of surprised you about what you found out, or did you kind of just think, yeah, no, that's kind of what I was expecting?
Yeah, because I had 2 goes at it, I wasn't really so surprised this time. I guess what I find really surprising is that for 30 years, we've been making the same mistakes and nothing has changed. So I'm particularly obsessed about this business about how we teach about other countries in the developing world. And it seems, to me, it seems completely crazy that geography geography students in our schools are taught that there are particular sort of countries, LEDCs and MEDCs most commonly, which nobody else talks about. The grown-ups don't talk about the rest of the world like that. Why do we? And it kind of crystallized to me when I was still working at the GA. We interviewed a lad for I think it was graphics job, and he came in confidently talking about all those LEDCs and so forth. And I was thinking, something's gone badly wrong here. Yeah.
I suppose the next question that comes from that is can you see a way through? I mean, if we haven't sorted it out, how do we sort it out, John? How do we sort out for the teaching of place?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, the grown-ups talk about high, middle, and low-income countries. I don't see why we can't do that in geography. It's kind of more respectful. And it also, the other flaw in this LEDC, MEDC thing is that people start think about development as a state of being rather than a process.
I'll come to David, who's got his hand up in a second. There's a couple of comments in the chat. One from Ellie Rawling. SCAA and QCA publish regular annual subject reports for geography. And she said, I don't know where these are available now, but she's got copies of them all from about 1994 to 2005. And David makes the point that the CAR, the Curriculum Assessment Review, is a real opportunity to address place skills, fieldwork and GIS, as you sort of highlighted, John.
Yeah, on those SCAA reports, QCA, I got hold of a couple, but they were kind of largely in the pre-internet age, so a lot of them aren't available even from the archive.
David, do you want to come on the microphone and ask your question?
Yeah, I agree with you, John, about place. It's almost embarrassing that place is consistently, well, it is embarrassing that place is consistently an issue. The last review, 2014, tried to address place by suggesting place-based units at a continental level as well as regional level, but still a lot of schools didn't do that, and they still used a place in a continent to illustrate a particular theme, given a single story of that country or that continent. So even though the national curriculum suggested place-based, encouraged schools without actually saying it to have place-based units, schools didn't do. So maybe at level 3, at the top level, in actually writing the national curriculum, it would be helpful at level 3 to make those suggestions. I'm particularly concerned with the issue with skills, because through lots of versions of the national curriculum in particular, but also at GCSE, they're a list which gives teachers the misconception potential, or they can misinterpret that and see that skills are content to be covered, rather than something as Mark in the latest Ofsted inspection report talks about progression in procedural knowledge. So plan for progression in those skills with a view of what the purpose of those skills are in terms of students understanding, communicating, working, thinking like a geographer, using those skills. Awarding bodies don't help, because in the guidance that they give in the examiner's reports talk about practicing those skills before the exam, but by the time their students are in year 11, they should just be using those skills as a matter of routine as part of a geographical inquiry.
Thanks so much, David. John?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. One of the things I meant to say at the last but one side about a coherent system is that one of the sources of less than coherence, if you know what I mean, is that the structures for CPD and for teacher training aren't as strong as they used to be, and the sources of subject renewal which we had in the past aren't there to the extent that they might be. In relation to the curriculum, it strikes me that now's another chance to have a look at the whole of it together as a kind of sequence, really. So Key Stage 3, to make sure that Key Stage 2 feeds into Key Stage 3 better, Key Stage 3 into GCSE and GCSE into A-level. For example, just puts a bit off-piste, why are there different assessment objectives for GCSE and A-level? I can't see the rationale for that. As a way of encouraging schools to plan long-term as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. Ellie.
Right, okay, sorry about that. John, just to say, if you want, I think I do have all those reports I mentioned. I mean, they weren't just standards, they were an overview of geography from various points of view, but they might be useful. I may be able to find actual documents that I've got on USB, in which case I could let you have them too.
That would certainly be helpful. I think I contributed obliquely to a couple of them.
You did,
which is probably the ones I found to report on. But yes, that would be certainly helpful, and particularly if there was any kind of impetus to look in more depth at a particular period or a particular theme, that would be extremely helpful.
Okay, well, I'll do that. The other thing I was going to say was, following on from what David was saying about place, we made a big, I was taken on as the drafter for the GCSE criteria for the latest set of specifications. And we made very clear, almost overly clear, I had to fight a few battles to make clear that place was an important thing in its own right, and that it shouldn't just be used as something that you used in a case study way to illustrate themes, and that awarding bodies should consider that somewhere within their specifications there should be the opportunity to study places in their own right. Well, when they came out, virtually none of them had done that. And the thing is, what was surprising to me was whoever they got to check the specifications against the criteria when they came in, nobody picked that up. It was us having fought the battles to get it mentioned in the criteria. So in other words, if you go back to the criteria, and particularly the aims, but also the blurb about what should be in what you're aiming at, what the objectives of GCSE geography are, it's all very clear in there. So it's very surprising. Well, I suppose it isn't surprising, but it's very annoying that it wasn't picked up in any way at all. And the only reason we got place a much higher status in the A level was because there was a very different system for doing that, where we had this ALCAB group, where we had people from higher education who supported the view that yes, place needed to have a much stronger position. So it's quite interesting that the process, the way in which the A-level criteria and the GCSE criteria were produced, resulted in a very different way in which place was dealt with.
Yeah, and I guess the A-level kind of assumes that they've done the business at GCSE, but of course they haven't.
Yeah,
and I think it's what I mentioned earlier is that there's very little incentive for awarding bodies to make significant changes for fear they're going to upset their market and the people are going to get another spec. I just also observe that probably you need to look at the outcomes in terms of what the examination papers are asking for. And the examination papers, I suggest, are unlikely to be asking for responses which pull together themes in a particular place or a particular region or a particular country, because that's not what the teachers will have been teaching. That it would be outcry, I suspect, if that happened, because it's not the way we do things. I think that's part of the problem, is that for going back to pre-national curriculum, this is the way that school geographers think. very difficult to turn that around.
David.
I think both GCSE and the national curriculum have a good set of aims. What's unfortunate at GCSE is you've got a good set of aims, thinking, working, and so on, like a geographer. But then the subject content played against that, which led to the specifications being ram full of content, which then leads to schools teaching to the specification and immersed in the content, and don't look at the relationship between the aims and the assessment objectives. So when I've worked with schools at GCSE and they've wanted to improve outcomes, and I says, well, do you share the aims with the students? And they've never read them themselves. So that lack of system to pull those things together is why GCSE is in such a mess and doing so much damage, I think, to geography education. And I think it's a major contributor as to why A-level numbers are going down.
I'm just going to go back to give Becky a chance to look at any further comments. Yeah, I'm just going to go back to this dysfunctional system, because it got quite easy for me to home in on what was lacking rather than what was working well. And also that sometimes the reports themselves, you get the hint that oh God, why aren't teachers doing this? It does strike me that if the system was a bit better, a bit more functional, it would supply more qualified teachers in both primary and secondary schools. It would supply more opportunities to do CPD. The Ofsted, although the Ofsted system it's all about notionally it's all about self-evaluation and self-improvement, but as regards geography, there's a way to go there, I'd say. So the context is the teaching staff shouldn't shoulder too much blame for this. I think it's the job of the state to provide support to a better functioning geography education environment. Alex is going to come in here and stop the waffling.
I was going to say we'll take one more comment from Alex, and then we're going to listen from to our responders. So Alex.
Thank you very much. Not waffling at all, John. But yeah, thank you for introduction and your reports, which I read a while ago actually. But I mean, starting with the positive, I think you know, a lot has changed since the last national curriculum was written. I think there's a lot of documents and books and things that have been produced. You know, the GA framework. So there's I think a conceptual language and tools that are available for teachers that are helping them to think and apply to their curriculum in a way that I think wasn't there, you know, 10, 15 years ago. So I think, you know, I've seen a big change in the language teachers are using, talking about procedural knowledge, for example. So I think, you know, I think there's a lot more thought going into the geography curriculum than there was before. And I think, you know, people, you know, on this in this meeting have contributed to that. One of the external examiners for our course used to say that my students would kind of parrot back to me that I would always be saying, "Where's the geography? Where's the geography in that lesson?" And I've noticed that over time that kind of has slipped away. And you know, I rarely come out of lessons now saying, "Where's the geography?" I think you know, that's become less of a problem. So some positives. I share your pain about the characterization of developing countries in particular. And you know, maybe we could write to the exam boards and get them to change their language. That would be something that might then sort of filter down, because I kind of expected it would be changing, but it's been really slow to do that. Another practical thing we could do John, in relation to your concern about places, which I also share. Maybe kind of encouraging teacher education to put more emphasis on that in their teacher training. So that would be another positive. I guess one of my biggest concerns, because I think things are very different in different schools, and I think a lot of whether geography and other subjects are good does vary a lot from one school to another. But as we know, I think the sort of formulaic lessons and standardized curriculum, often with standardized PowerPoint presentations, leads to a lack of creativity. So yeah, I wonder. And that's kind of a broader cultural problem. So I think we've got more geography going on, but often there is kind of a delivery consumerist approach to knowledge, isn't there? So that's an ongoing concern, which hopefully we can address. And then finally, I've got a question for you, John. You're saying about standards and Ofsted. I'm not sure we can rely on Ofsted. Can we rely on Ofsted for standards? I know maybe we shouldn't, but aren't they moving away from subject-specific inspections? And I think they no longer have subject-specific people for inspections. So anyway, you might be able to shed some light on that.
I can't, but I think that's exactly the case.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think as an organisation, I'm not in favour of Ofsted at all. In fact, I was an Ofsted inspection myself once for a fairly short period. But I think it kind of needs a bit of a look about what its remit is really, and we could really do a bit more consistency. I'm just going to pick up on something you just said about the PowerPoint presentations, and it does strike me that if you've tried to mitigate against weak teaching in your group of schools by providing all the lessons, but the lessons are PowerPoint, it's inevitable that geographical skills will suffer, because really those PowerPoint presentations are going to major on knowledge and understanding, with fewer opportunities for investigation. Yeah. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you very much to everybody who's asked a question, and also to John for responding. We're going to turn to Iram now, who is going to be our first respondent, and is just going to, I think, talk for 5-10 minutes in response to the things that John has said.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's nice to be in this space. Yeah, thank you, John. That was like a really interesting report for me as well, like personally with my PhD that I'm currently looking at decolonizing geography. So lots of interesting things that you've highlighted in the report. So I understand like it's a comprehensive long-term overview of the standards and challenges, but I'm just wondering some of the changes that we saw, like some of the fluctuations, especially in terms of the blip that we talked about in 2009 and 2010 in terms of assessment. I'm thinking perhaps it was to do with the controlled assessment, where teachers had a little bit more say in, how the students were actually conducting their fieldwork and writing it up, and perhaps there was more support there. And could that have been a reason why the grades went up a little bit? Do students need more scaffolding? Do they need more support? What I found interesting was that you talk about that idea of, people or teachers effectively, like struggling effectively to teach about place. And I think that is so important, and especially with like decolonial thinking and anti-racism thinking as well. And it kind of feeds into the geographical skills that we kind of use with fieldwork as well, and how we actually use language and kind of navigate, what is set, I would say, in stone when we're presented with the specification, and how teachers read the specification in relation to the actual pedagogy. So I think it was really good that you highlighted this idea of, what's happening at key stage 3 in relation to the other stages in terms of curriculum planning. And I'm just thinking maybe at Key Stage 3, teachers have that freedom where they can engage more with students' personal geographies and kind of explore that in more detail and have freedom to talk about place in that context, like especially with what kind of discussions are going on in the room and with the geography in the news, etc. Because let's face it, I think I'm going to come to some of the challenges of the report as well, in terms of what I felt the report perhaps wasn't highlighting. Like, for example, I felt a very strong case for a lack of student voice and experiences. And I think that can shed light on how geography education kind of impacts those students' actual engagement with the subject. Because I feel like perhaps talking to the students a bit more, having their voice in the report about why they are taking geography or not taking geography. Say, for example, GCSE students choosing not to take A-level, for example. What's the reason behind that? I know as a teacher, I can give multiple reasons with my own students, but I'm just wondering, is there scope for us to kind of look into that? And those practical strategies as well of overcoming those challenges, especially those sort of challenges that non-specialists might have. And we talked about how, if we give these Oak Academy style PowerPoints to teachers, and it would kind of take away that autonomy or that creativity that Alex has just mentioned as well. So there was a lot of things going in my mind as I was kind of reading this report in terms of that as well. And also I think sometimes what might lack in our specifications are the innovative kind of aspect of the actual teaching practices, like the pedagogical changes that are taking place as well. Like, I know me myself, I'm quite into looking at decolonial thinking and the way in which sometimes some of our teaching methods can be oppressive, and how we kind of navigate that. Like, we can't have one size fits all. Obviously, all teachers are different and they work in different ways. But coming back to that idea of what you were mentioning, John, about the way in which we talk about other places, I'm doing that in inverted commas, and the kind of pedagogical techniques we might use in the classroom, that varies hugely as well. And plus, I think what happens often with our specifications is that we don't take heed of social media and the amount of information overload that our students are presented with as well. So there's quite a lot that this report kind of alludes to, but perhaps could go into more detail. Coming back to the global and cultural perspectives, I think I feel like there's always going to be that need for that broader context of how geography education actually relates to those different that plurality, isn't it, in geography education? And I think coming back to this idea of the danger of asking the government body to kind of dictate what we teach in the geography classroom is quite problematic in itself, because I think historically with geography education we've seen the same voices. And you mentioned the single story. Well, we've had the same sort of white colonial kind of voices throughout, obviously, the reports. And I'm not saying I'm an expert on the reports, and I'd very much, Eleanor, would love to read some of the reports as well for my own research. But just coming back quickly to this idea of perhaps we do need a more decolonial and anti-racist kind of approach to the way in which we approach the curriculum. But we won't be able to do that if it's just that single story or that one narrative that we're always kind of reporting on or always taking heed of. So I think that practical mentioning of
Iram, I think we've lost you. I think we've lost your sound. Don't know if you can hear me. We'll see if Iram comes back. I suppose while we're waiting for that, John, is there anything that you can sort of say in response to some of the things that Iram was talking about? You're on mute.
Yeah, certainly rethinking fieldwork is obviously a bit of a priority. I'm not sure if necessarily controlled assessment is the way to go. Student voice in the reports didn't really come through. I'll have to go back and heroically read them all again and see if there was any mention of that. Yeah, decolonising, I really don't want to sort of bang on about this too much, but it does seem to me if talking about the rest of the world in a respectful way and talking about the rest of the world which is about 2026 rather than 2000 or whatever, will be kind of half the battle, it seems to me. Yeah, very closely connected, I would say.
Thank you. I don't know if Iram can actually hear us. I will message her to see. But whilst I'm sorting that out, Sarah.
Very much the Today programme tactic.
I know. I'm well practiced.
Hello, let me see if I can get my slides to work. And then if Iram comes back, we can switch back maybe. See my screen there?
Yeah, that's all good.
And if I do that, is that?
Yeah, that's
we're good. Okay, well, it says I'm a bit unstable, apparently, internet terms as well. So hopefully we'll see how we go. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to respond to this report as well. I found it really insightful, and it's been really interesting to hear John's analysis and the responses. Yeah, lots of prevailing challenges across phases, which I found really fascinating. So just by way of a brief introduction to me, and because I think that context is important, because my perspective can only come from my own experience, I completed my undergraduate geography degree at Bristol, and then I spent several years working in urban design and planning before I trained to be a teacher. And more recently, I completed the Masters in Geography Education at UCL. So I was geography subject leader at large primary schools across the key stages. Much of my own teaching practice and master's research is focused on early years geography. So spoiler alert, that will come up in a bit. More recently, I am a member of the early years and primary phase committee, one of the membership committees of the GA, and I now work in an advisory role. So I mention all of that because my background is perhaps not typical of the profile of a primary geographer often described in the reports. I was actually one of 3 teachers with geography backgrounds in my last school, and I think that in itself highlights some of the points that have been made about how variable context can be for primary geography and how levels of subject expertise and quality will therefore differ so considerably between schools, as John has referenced. So one of the things that struck me the most in the report was the similarity of the challenges across phases, particularly actually between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, and as we've heard, creeping into Key Stage 4. So issues with limited subject specialism, gaps in leadership, challenges with the coherence of the curriculum, and the time pressures sort of appear consistently. And it just suggests that many of the issues identified are not phase specific, and that there could be some real value in addressing them collectively. So the report highlights how geography in primary schools is often sort of marginalised or absorbed within topic-based curricula. That was my experience to some extent. When I first became geography leader, the school curriculum was entirely topic-based, and it was a whole school decision that we moved towards separate subject teaching. At the time, I was keen not to lose everything about the integrated approach. I felt that real world geography is complex and interconnected, and I kind of felt that to excite primary children about geography, we needed to retain some of that. So retaining some of that felt sort of important to reflect, I guess, authentic geographical thinking. I think that sometimes geography can move to the abstract too quickly for younger children. I felt there was some developmentally appropriate practice that was lost through being too rigid. That creativity was lost. And I guess, reading the report and hearing the reflections, I feel like that is still a danger, regardless of the move to more discrete subject teaching in primary schools. That sort of improvement is perhaps fragile. So then my experience of subject leadership was also quite closely reflected by the findings of the report. So in many primary schools, the leadership structures and any additional responsibility focuses mainly on English and maths, while the foundation subjects sort of sit outside those structures. So in the schools I worked in, I had to sort of campaign to be geography lead. I can't sort of comment on how that would work in very small schools, where you'd have sort of one teacher leading lots of subjects, and also in then large sort of trusts. The schools I've worked in have both been maintained primary schools and quite large, so there was a geography subject leader. I felt when I took over those leaderships of geography that the previous systems had largely focused on procedural elements such as checking equipment, monitoring systems, and record keeping. So I was sort of fortunate that I've always worked with brilliant reflective teachers who were very willing to discuss their experiences honestly. And through those conversations, it became quite clear that many of the teachers I worked with felt quite uncertain about geography's aims, its place within the curriculum, and how best to approach its teaching. It's worth saying that that wasn't the case with most of the other national curriculum subjects. It seemed to be a geography specific phenomenon. So the one point particularly resonated with me from the report, which was the observation that primary teachers often demonstrate strong pedagogy and age range expertise, but feel less confident with geography as a subject. And this is exactly what I saw in practice. So teachers who were highly skilled at teaching the age range and engaging pupils effectively, but who felt unsure about geographical concepts and approaches underpinning their lessons. So then I did find it quite difficult to find CPD for that level, but using Geographical Association, Royal Geographical Society resources, I sort of developed my own CPD sessions really tailored to the needs of the staff, trying to sort of focus on connecting the strong teaching practice that already existed with geographical thinking. Equally, for my own development as a subject leader, I also found that much of the available CPD focused on generic leadership rather than subject-specific issues. At the time, there weren't sort of local geography subject networks available, so it just really does reinforce the importance of like the academic work, professional publications, and the subject association. So sort of completely sort of support the challenges that have been made around self-evaluation. As a primary teacher, I would echo what has been said about it being difficult to judge what strong geography provision looks like where you haven't got those shared reference points, and it's quite difficult as a subject leader to advocate and affect change if you haven't got that. In my experience as well, where there's a vacuum like that, something off the shelf will be put in place to fill the gap that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate in disciplinary terms. Again, I would agree with what's been said about place, skills and field work. So in Key Stage 1, the curriculum simply asks pupils to study a place. In terms of geographical differences and similarities, no guidance about how to choose or how to study. The history curriculum does give a little bit of guidance and some examples, which I think is quite helpful. So in practice, this was something that teachers did find really challenging, and part of my role as subject lead was to try to support colleagues in thinking about how places could be selected and then how meaningful kind of studies could be developed. It's also important, I think, to recognise that learning about place begins well before Key Stage 1 geography. So in early years, children explore place through play and storytelling. Most classrooms have got a home corner, an actual representation of homes, small world play, representation of places, picture books and stories. They all provide opportunities for children to encounter and imagine different places. Within those experiences, there's already many geographical ideas being developed, but also misconceptions about how places are and how they're represented, and also kind of whose geography is being represented and whether those represent everybody. So in my view, teaching about place needs to be developmentally appropriate and should build carefully from those early experiences. So skills are more clearly outlined in the curriculum, but in practice, and I've heard that this is obviously not a phase isolated issue. In practice, that does lead to them being taught, I found, in isolation, sometimes outside of geography lessons or geography work. So I did find that as well. And field work, I would just say it just varied considerably. So practical constraints, time, staffing, transport, it fell to the subject lead to take an active role in championing field work. But I did find that small scale local field work made such a significant difference to people's engagement and understanding. So I'd just like to highlight the position of early years within the discussions of primary geography and the sort of systemic reasons why it's elusive within the report. So it's understandable given the evidence base. The Ofsted subject reports focus on key stages 1 to 4. So EYFS practice is rarely captured in the material. It does come back in sort of 2023, getting our bearings. It had a more strengthened role from there. Early years geography has historically been recognised as having a research gap. It's sort of well established, and that's not true of the other national curriculum subjects. I do think we see the impact of that here. Despite this, maybe interestingly, there is an example in the report. I think it's on page 10, which is a early years example and involves dramatic play in a topic-based approach. It's interesting that particular example has been repeatedly shared across geography education publications, which I think perhaps highlights the small number of examples available. And that also just highlights variation within the primary phase. So in my experience, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 often show quite different levels of curriculum confidence, subject knowledge and depth. So sort of treating them as a single block can sometimes obscure some of those distinctions. So it'd be great if future subject reports could recognise early years, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 as related but quite distinct stages in some ways. I think that could enrich some of the subject conversations. So just to finish, much in the report resonated strongly with my own experience as primary geography subject leader. I found that teachers frequently brought genuine enthusiasm to the subject, but there's lots of structural barriers related to cost, time, subject knowledge, professional support. And as I said, I feel the improvement in primary geography is fragile, and we need continual focus on CPD, support for subject leaders and teachers, even when priorities shift away. And the appetite, I think, for the CPD from organisations like the GA, from primary colleagues, does show that ongoing demand for support. And perhaps the most striking takeaway for me from the report was that many of the challenges are cross-phase, and this suggests that maybe improving geography is not solely a challenge for the individuals, but for the wider subject community, as in John's conclusion. So yeah, that's my response. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Sarah. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
So, John, any comments from Sarah's thoughts there?
Well, no, because she knows far more about primary schools than I do. I'm just going to reflect on a couple of things. One was, I'm just going to reinforce the last report was based on only visits to only 25 primary schools, so it is a little bit thin there. I'm also going to remind myself that although everybody's got all in for subject-based teaching in primary schools, the reports in the sort of middling period presented examples of good practice from teaching geography within wider themes. So I don't think the two things are necessarily antithetical to each other, though I'm not a total expert on this. I'll certainly take your point about early years being out of the picture. And it kind of reminds me of one of my main themes, which possibly didn't bring out sufficiently, is that we're kind of, I feel that skating over pretty thin evidence in terms of what's has gone on in schools and what is going on in schools. And the only way really to find out more would be some proper in-depth research, which clearly we haven't got the means to do.
Thanks, John. I think we've got Iram back.
Sorry about that. I think I was
don't worry, Iram.
Connected.
I just wondered if you've got any other points to share.
No, I mean, I'll just conclude. I'm not sure where I was cut off actually, but I did become a bit passionate. Yeah, I was just thinking. Yeah, I was just kind of mentioning this idea of the current limits to like us, othering other places, and the need for like decolonizing, and listening to some of the arguments made by some of the collectives as well, because they do have sort of written sort of articles on like language, like the way in which we might use slums, for example, and how we see this reoccurring in some of our textbooks and in the specifications as well, and the way in which certain groups, marginalized groups, are kind of also portrayed, and this whole idea of having that intentional curriculum planning that prioritizes the inclusivity and representation, and that idea of how we bring social justice into dimensions of geography. And I think, just to conclude, there seems to be like a disconnect between the like pedagogy, I don't know, some people say pedagogy, but pedagogy specification and the student experience, or the student personal geographies, and what we might be able to do to bring that element into this as well. And I think I'm not sure if you heard, but I was just mentioning student voice was missing quite a bit in that report.
Yeah,
thank you for listening. Sorry about being cut off.
Thanks, Iram. It's one of the things I noted down, and really that wasn't something that Ofsted picks up at all in any of the reports that I can remember. I can work back through. It's possibly a bit too fine a detail, or it might possibly appear in the sort of general school sections of wider inspection reports rather than in geography. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else, Becky?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we're coming to the end, and just want to say a massive thank you, John, for your talk initially, but also for our responders, Iram and Sarah, and also for the really good sort of questions and discussion throughout the session. We've got literally about sort of 2 or 3 more minutes left. So I just wanted, John, if you've got any final thoughts, or if anybody has any final comments or thoughts that they want to just very quickly share.
Yeah, I'll just sort of pick up on Sarah's very positive vibe that these things are fixable by the community. And it would be really helpful if we found some sort of toe holes in the review of the national curriculum that we could kind of build on.
That's very positive. Ellie?
I just wanted to pick up, and I think it's been reinforced by other speakers. Right at the very beginning, John, in your report, you were saying that Ofsted noted that for both primary and secondary, what came out was the importance of clarity of the curriculum, the balance between knowledge, understanding, skills, inquiry, and how to move forward, continuity and progression. I was scribbling, so that's not exactly what you said, but that's close to it. And I was thinking, and then it's come out in a way with all the other speakers that, in a way, if we got this review at the moment, those are the things. It's not just tinkering with bits of content that's needed. It's something that makes sure what we need to do through the association and through the way that the review is being done, make sure that geography is much clearer about how it works as a subject, the concepts, the particular substantive content, the skills of inquiry that are threaded through it, and what continuity of progression looks like. And I mean, I think it's really important that, you know, we make clear to Steve, who I think is Steve Brace, who's active in this review, that those are the kind of things that need doing. It's not just adding bits of things. And I think you said that yourself, John. It's
Yes.
not just, yeah, it's...
Exactly. So I think that in the past, there was, in the distant past, there was non-statutory guidance for this sort of thing. Well, that kind of role has been taken over by the subject associations. But I don't see why the curriculum document itself shouldn't repeat those expectations in very simple terms. That the job of the at school level is to take this and make a framework for learning out of it, and a framework for progression. Yeah, and David's still here. David has done exactly that for Key Stage 3 under the old in old money. I'm sure he'll revise it for the new version. I'm also going to take something from something Sarah mentioned. We've realised, I think, for quite a long time that geography, for whatever reason, is a more complex subject document for people to wrestle with than, for example, history. It'll be very interesting to see if we could work out an easier way of packaging it so that it was so that particularly non-specialists could interpret it more easily.
Thanks ever so much. And yes, I mean, lots of really, really, I think, practical things as well that I think we can certainly think about as a community. I'm going to draw it. Oh, sorry, John.
Yeah, I mean, Becky, if you could kind of feed some of those headlines back to Steve, I think that would be quite a useful little nudge from the discussion. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I was going to say, I'm going to bring the discussion to a close now. You will get a copy of the recording, and I think it's also going to go onto the GEReCo website as well, so that you can watch it back at your leisure if you want to, or share it with other people. But thanks ever so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you in very soon, either in similar fora or in the GEReCo seminar next year. Okay, so thank you, everybody.
Thanks.